We've all heard the debate, carburettors versus EFI. What's better? It's not just about how they deliver fuel and air, it's about power, efficiency, emissions and reliability. In this episode of Motorhaus, I'm going to take a deep dive into both forms of technology and give you the lowdown on the components of EFI and how it works. And once you understand the theory, you'll be ready for the next video on Motorhaus, where I show you how to fix EFI in real time on this Volvo 240. Now though, it's time to head to the workshop. Let's go back to absolute first principles on a 4-stroke petrol engine. And let's look at the 4 main components that an engine needs to run. It needs air, it needs fuel, it needs spark, and it needs compression. Now, compression is handled by the mechanical nature of the engine. We're not covering engine architecture today. Spark, ignition system. We're not covering the intricacies of ignition systems here today. If you would like to see that, I can do a video on that. What we're really interested in here is the air and fuel side of things. How do we draw in to an engine a correctly metered charge of atomized fuel and air? If you go back in time, you'd have used one of these. This, if you're under the age of about 40 or 50, this is a carburettor. This one is an SU carburettor. Very fond of SU carburettors. Now, a carburettor uses the principle of carburation to draw fuel and air into the engine. Now, what does that mean? Carburation is where you are sucking fuel into the engine under vacuum. A carburettor uses the principle of pressure in a venturi tube. So you create a restriction, airspeed increases, and then what you have joining that tube effectively is another tube with petrol in, and the engine sucks this mixture of fuel and air into the engine. It's very simple. The entire process of mixing fuel and air is done in one completely mechanical unit. And for a significant period of the life of the petrol engine and the car, this was the primary means of delivering a metered fuel-air mixture to an engine. Carburettors do have some inherent issues. By virtue of the fact that they're an entirely mechanical device, the air-fuel mixture to go into an engine has an optimum ratio. That's called the stoichiometric ratio. And the quantity of fuel to air varies upon a lot of environmental factors. Factors such as ambient temperature, what's the inlet temperature of the air coming into the engine, what's the coolant temperature, what's the barometric pressure? For example, how high above sea level are you? Generally speaking, although there are some very simple mechanical compensatory factors in some carburettors, carburettors are kind of a set and forget device. You are able to tune them for really a best compromise in one set of circumstances, and that's as good as they can do. An obvious downside to that, for example, is a cold start of an engine, where an engine requires a much richer fuel-air mixture. Generally speaking, you have to use a mechanical choke, right? And metering and making sure you have the right choke setting on an engine, you have to do that manually as you're driving every time until the engine's warmed up. The carburettor can't do that by itself. There are some other issues with carburettors as well, is that because they rely on a fuel bowl, a float level, the angle of the carburettor can be absolutely critical in the way they run. So that, for example, can be an issue in certain circumstances if you're cornering particularly hard, or if these for example, used in aircraft. Perhaps the biggest single downside of these is that because a carburettor cannot tell what's coming out of the exhaust pipe, it's not able to accurately meter the fuel enough to meet a lot of the emissions and fuel economy targets which were increasingly becoming important in the 70s and 80s. So there was a need for a better method. Enter fuel injection.
It's a new motor with a brand new engine that does away with carburetors and uses a fuel injection system.
Unlike a carburettor that has to suck a mixture of fuel and air into the engine, fuel injection, as the name implies, it injects a pressurized metered dose of fuel directly into the engine. Buy one of these. This is a fuel injector. There you go. There are various types of these, but instead of having to draw an atomized mixture of fuel and air in, fuel comes out the end there, it goes in there, and it will squirt a metered dose of fuel into the engine. Now, where did this idea come from? There were pre-war a few experimental fuel injection systems, but some of the first notable uses of fuel injection technology came on World War II aircraft, the Daimler-Benz engine Messerschmitts being one of the most notable examples. And it was very quickly found that that provided some very significant operational advantages. The main one of which is an aircraft that is often doing dogfighting, rolling at all different kinds of angles and so on. That engine would work exactly the same at almost any angle because there weren't float bowls to upset. There wasn't this mixture of fuel and air to upset. It was squirting a directly metered dose of fuel into the engine. That same technology, post-war, miraculously managed to find itself into Mercedes-Benz Grand Prix cars, and the very first road car to ever feature fuel injection was the massively advanced Mercedes-Benz 300 SL back in 1955. A few years later, the very advanced Lucas mechanical fuel injection system, the advantages of that system, which was not only better efficiency, but increased power and drivability across the rev range, were recognised in Formula One, and very quickly Formula One engines and a lot of competition engines adopted fuel injection. A very notable use again in road cars of that Lucas injection system was on Triumphs of the 60s and 70s, so the TR5, the TR6 and the 2.5 PI all used mechanical metered fuel injection systems. There was a problem. These mechanical systems, generally speaking, were expensive. They were also quite fussy. These were not fuel injection systems as we think of them now as being pretty much turnkey and go. They were performance systems that were fitted primarily for performance rather than emissions. And in actual fact, if you have a look at things like the TR5 and TR6, when they went to America, they actually ended up with carburettors because the fuel injection systems of the time weren't clean enough to meet emissions regulations. However, something was around the corner that was about to change it all. In the 1970s, Bosch introduced a real landmark fuel injection system, which was called K-Jetronic. Now, this was still a largely mechanical fuel system, but it was one of the first fuel systems that arrived that also decreased emissions whilst having no obvious trade-off in power. In actual fact, in a lot of instances, it provided a boost in power for the engine. The major landmark came in the 1980s with Bosch L-Jetronic, which was arguably, and as far as I'm aware, the first fully electronic mass-produced implementation of an electronic fuel injection system. I've got a few bits of L-Jetronic around. Well, this is a Lucas 4CU system off a Rover V8, which was a variation of L-Jetronic, but there's the enormous big ECU from the 1980s, and here is one of the important devices that made it possible. This is the airflow meter, which has a flap in here. These systems are often called flapper injection, and as air came through, this flap would move, and as with all the other components, they would feed back to the ECU, and it would read from a map which would tell the ECU exactly what fuel to inject, in what quantity, at the right time, under given circumstances. And with the advent of electronic fuel injection came another very big improvement. At a similar period in time, Bosch invented something called the oxygen sensor, the lambda sensor. In fact, if you look on the front of my Volvo here, it says lambda sonde. Volvo, one of the first people to fit oxygen sensors to cars. And what that meant is that for the very first time, a car's fuel system could not only monitor all the sensors at the front end to tell it what it needed to inject, but it could also measure its own emissions and self-tune itself in real time. That was such a massive, massive development. That's called closed loop feedback. And that meant that for the first time, cars could run catalytic converters, emissions equipment, without a significant payoff in performance, because the engines could run efficiently enough to allow the catalytic converters to work properly. And indeed with these Volvos, I think it was mid to late 70s, terribly advanced. It was one of the cleanest cars in the world at the time because of that pioneering use of closed loop EFI. Of course, the other thing is that when you have efficiency, it means you get greater fuel economy and also, which we love as car enthusiasts, more power. EFI really is having your cake and eat it. Now, if you're going to understand a fuel injection system to diagnose it, what you really need to understand is the individual components involved in it all. So let's start at the very tail end of the car from the fuel tank forwards. A fuel pump and a fuel pressure regulator of some kind. Now, you may end up having multiple fuel pumps. Quite often there's a low pressure lift pump that then delivers that fuel to a high pressure pump. Sometimes you just have a single high pressure pump. I've even heard of cars that have multiple fuel pumps in there. But fundamentally, you are going to have a pump that creates high fuel pressure. You then need a fuel pressure regulator to make sure that a consistent pressure of fuel is delivered to the fuel rail. Now from there, we've got the fuel rail and the injectors themselves. That's perhaps the most obvious part of the components of a fuel injection system. Now, what you will most commonly see on petrol engines, particularly of this period, is what's called port injection, which is where the injectors are mounted on the inlet manifold and they squirt a metered dose of fuel typically onto the back of the inlet valve. Some engines use what's called throttle body injection. They'll have one or two injectors right at the throttle body itself. Those are called wet flow systems. Most modern petrol engines use what's called direct injection, which is where the fuel injector is actually mounted and squirts directly into the combustion chamber itself. Either way, somewhere along the line, there will be fuel injectors which are mounted where the engine designer has decided that metered dose of fuel needs to go. Okay, so we've got our pressurised fuel, we've got our fuel injectors, we've got our ECU that's got all the brains and the knowledge. That needs some additional input so that it can tell what to do, what to fire, when to fire the injectors, how much fuel to put in. So we have a few fundamental, very important components. One of those is the throttle position sensor. The ECU needs to know how much demand is being inputted from the driver at any given time. How then does the ECU know how much fuel the engine's demanding and what kind of speed the engine's covering? Well, it has to have at minimum a crank angle sensor. So the ECU needs to know A, is the engine turning, and also where is it in that rotational cycle. So as a bare minimum, an engine will have at least one engine rotation sensor, we'll call it that. There'll be at least one sensor that reports back to the ECU engine rotation. Now, I was talking about air. What do we know about how is the ECU going to know how much air is coming into an engine? There will also be some kind of air meter unit. There are a few differences with these. Early systems like this, these early flapper systems that you will see used extensively on 80s and 90s cars, this is an air flow meter. What this does is it actually measures the amount of flow of air that's coming through. These work fine. There are some issues, is that by virtue of having this barn door in the way, this itself does provide a little bit of a restriction to airflow. What replaced that, which is a much more efficient method, they're often called a hot wire sensor, and that's an air mass meter. And what that does is it actually measures how dense the air is that's coming through. A subtle difference, both of them allow the ECU to know how much air is coming to the engine at any given time. You might also have a manifold vacuum sensor as well. And in some aftermarket systems, particularly if you're running forced induction like turbocharging or supercharging, a MAP sensor might actually completely replace a conventional air meter. Now those are the fundamentals that you'll find in any fuel injection system. There are some additional components which I've already sort of touched upon. So let's talk about the lambda sensor, the oxygen sensor. Not all electronic fuel injection systems have these, but certainly if your car has a catalytic converter on it, it will have an oxygen sensor on it. The oxygen sensor feeds back to the ECU and lets it know what is coming out of the engine. Now, there's at least one of those. Some cars may have as many as 4 or even 6 or more oxygen sensors, but typically there'll be one of those that allows the car to run in what's called closed loop. There will also be some kind of temperature sensor on the engine. This is very important. When an engine's cold, when it detects that the coolant temperature is cold, the air-fuel ratio will need to be much richer than when the engine's fully warmed up. And also, as the engine warms up, it allows the ECU to dynamically adjust the mixture. That is one of the features that is responsible for EFI cars being generally so easy to own and drive. You can just get in, turn the key, and regardless of the outside temperature, regardless of how warm the engine is, it'll start and run, providing that everything is in good condition. Additional things that you are likely to find. Some cars, this one has it, for example, you may find a knock sensor. That is effectively a microphone that listens to the engine and listens for the effects of knock or pre-detonation. That can be caused by either an overly lean mixture or an overly advanced ignition, and that can feed back to the engine ECU to allow it to control the fuel mixture, or if you have a system that's full engine management, it can also control the ignition timing. The chances are as well is that your ECU will have an input from a road speed sensor of some kind so that it knows when the car's moving. You're also likely to find an idle control valve. An idle control valve allows the ECU to adjust a metered amount of fresh air in to either raise or lower the idle speed of the engine. In conjunction with the road speed sensor, that means that when you pull up at the traffic lights, it'll maintain the idle speed of the car, can prevent the engine from stalling, for example. Some more modern systems will also have additional sensors and additional inputs. For example, if you have a drive-by-wire system, your throttle pedal is in fact just a throttle position sensor, and what it then does is it has a stepper motor that opens the throttle butterfly itself. Also, if your car has variable cam timing, valve timing, there will be additional outputs from the ECU for that. Again, I can't cover every single ECU system ever made, but what we're trying to look at here is an understanding of the absolute basics of EFI, the absolute basic building blocks of the system, and hopefully from that you'll have a bit better idea of how EFI works and how to diagnose it when something goes wrong. So as you can see, EFI offers a significant number of advantages over carburettors. Easier cold starting, lower emissions, better efficiency, better economy, more power. Kind of sounds like that's the end of conversation, right? Well, it's not quite as simple as that. As you've probably deduced by now, EFI is reliant on lots and lots of separate individual components to make the system work. And all of those components have to be in tip-top condition for an EFI system to work properly. As you can see, mine wasn't in tip-top condition, and it took quite a lot of troubleshooting to find out exactly what was wrong. In comparison, carburettors are relatively simple, self-contained, and fairly easy to troubleshoot if and when anything goes wrong. There's also a cost difference. Generally speaking, because of the simplicity of it, a carburetted setup tends to be cheaper than an EFI setup, especially if you're looking at running one as an amateur install. As a case in point, on my own Land Rover, I removed the full engine management system and backdated that engine back to carburettors. And that wasn't just because of cost, it was because if I'm in the middle of nowhere, I need something that's very easy to troubleshoot, very easy to fix in the field with minimal tools. And that generally is not something that you can say of EFI. EFI requires specialist components to fix, things like the lambda sensors, the other sensors, etc. And quite often it will require some kind of diagnostic tools that you have to have with you. That's even if you are able to get into the EFI system to find out what's wrong with it in the first place. Having said that, EFI does offer a huge amount of advantages. It just takes a little bit more time and a little bit more knowledge generally to troubleshoot and fix. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in the next video on Motorhaus. So be sure to subscribe, be sure to like this video and share it amongst your friends if you found it useful. It's goodbye from me, Mr. Bob, and goodbye from another episode of Motorhaus.